So why don't we get started? Barbara, I don't know if the air's on or not. Welcome, everybody. I don't know what we anticipated, but Arthur Holt is the chair of the Spiritual Growth Committee here at Central. Hold your hand up, Arthur.
You didn't know where that. I wasn't anticipating.
And he said, I don't know how to do that. He asked me if he would do it. And obviously he's doing something right. We're delighted to have everybody here. Cam Treese is a senior pastor here, if you don't know Cam. And sometimes he's the HVAC operator. He does a number of things. Now, I have a critic in the room, and I will not let her give me a sign when I'm doing some presentation that I need to speak up. But if I don't speak up, when we get home, she'll give me real criticism. So I'm going to try to stay in front of this, and we are Zooming this tonight. Janet, you may have set this up, or you and Paige, or somebody.
It's not Zooming live, but there is going to be a recording.
Okay, it's been recorded.
Right.
So I have here in my hand I have here in my hand something for all of you who are not members of this church. Now, whether you're members of this church or not, you're always welcome, because we are more interested in our community than we are in our membership. But if you're not a member of this church, raise your hand. What I've got here, ticket of 3 dinners, one Wednesday night while this is going on. All you need to do is call.
I had a free dinner tonight.
We have Wednesday evening dinners that are wholesome and full of fellowship and fun while we're enjoying food. And you're welcome to join us. All we ask is that you call the church 582-7263 on a Monday and let us know that you're going to be there, so the hostess will know how much to prepare. And we'd love to have you here. Several of you have asked if you need to get a copy of the book. Some of you know that until a couple of years ago, I taught over at Wofford, and the bookstore loves for the students to buy the books. I'm not sure why they do that, because they never read the books. I'll talk a little bit about the book and a couple of other books that McLaren has written, and then you can decide whether to get the book or not. I have a handout here that will be helpful for you for the next 4 sessions after tonight. And when you leave, and I'll try to remember to remind you to pick one of those handouts up as you leave.
That's from the book. Is that stuff from the book?
That's from the book, especially related to those 4 stages of faith. More and more when I teach, and I have asked this question when I teach the upper room Sunday school class, which meets in this room, and I teach a number of times in there, and there's some other people in here who teach in there. I wonder more and more whether what we talk about as it relates to faith in Sunday school class or when we're worshiping in the sanctuary, I wonder if we're making a difference. I enjoy teaching, and a lot of Sundays after I teach, people will make some complimentary remark about something I've said. And of course, I like that. Cam and Paige like that too, because one of them gets at each door when the sanctuary after church, and you can't leave without telling them what a good job they did. But still, I wonder, are we relevant to what's going on today? Brian McLaren has obviously asked himself that question, and he's made some career changes in his life as he's attempted to address that. He was an English teacher first after graduation from college, and then a pastor for 24 years. Now he's an author, an activist, public theologian, and a frequent guest lecturer, not just in this country, but internationally. Done in St. Simons, Georgia, at the Methodist Retreat Center down there. Every January, they used to have an event called the January Adventure. I think they've changed the name of that, but it still meets. He's now the director of that, in addition to being on the faculty with Richard Rohr at the Center for Action and Contemplation out in Santa Fe. I've read a number of his books, a couple of others besides the one that is being used for this study that I recommend to you. His latest book is this book, Do I Stay Christian? And we actually did a study in this class 3 or 4 months ago on this book. And then prior to the book, Faith After Doubt, he wrote this book about the Great Spiritual Migration. And I'm sure every one of you have heard somebody say, I'm not very religious anymore, but I'm spiritual. And I don't know how you react to that. It's pervasive enough in the dialogue that goes on around faith communities today that there is something to that. And I'm not sure that that's all bad. And I'll try to explain that. But nonetheless, I wonder if we make a difference. And I also wonder if we're relevant to what's going on today. Now, in this book, McLaren uses at least half or more of this book to relate some stories that have been told to him by people he's encountered along his journey when they began to wonder and feel challenged about things they were asked to believe and behaviors they were asked to practice in the faith communities that they belonged to. And some of those people were so wounded, they've actually left the faith communities and are doing something else. If you're interested in that book, those stories that he tells and the way he analyzes those stories have significant value and are illustrative in ways that would help you understand why people begin to doubt their faith. In my notes that I was preparing for this tonight, one was introduction. 2, who is Brian McLaren? 3 is the book. And my 4th point here was a question. Have any of your beliefs stopped working, or are you doubting things that you used to believe were true? Now, I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands right now. I'm going to tell you some things that caused me to begin to doubt, and some things that just didn't work for me anymore. I I'll also tell you ahead of time, and we won't have enough time, but I love to meet folks for coffee or lunch or some afternoon refreshment, and we could talk some more about it then. I will tell you that my understanding of how I have reacted to those doubts and how I have reacted to the discovery that some things don't work for me anymore. My reaction has not been paralysis or backward kind of motion, but I'm almost certain that in every case, my reaction has been growth. And so if you have experienced doubt, you don't need to listen to me. Go get the book and let Brian McLaren tell you it's okay to experience doubt. Something good will probably come out of it if you continue to pursue that doubt and what happened. One of the things that created a lot of doubt for me happened back in the late 90s when Matthew Fox started the school out on the West Coast called the University of Creation Spirituality. And that was at a time in my life when I was more in charge of my own schedule than I was when I was practicing medicine. And under the influence of three women, Patsy and Ann Howard and Betty Griffin, I enrolled in that program. And at that coffee we're going to have one morning over here, I can tell you how transformative that was. Matthew Fox, as a theologian, basically said this: the creation is good. And he spent the entire curriculum trying to help us understand that the creation is not in a fallen state in need of redemption. The creation has been good from the beginning. My interest in that program was stimulated by an interest I have in spirituality and healing when I would see two patients in the office, same age, same sex, same socioeconomic status, and the same diagnosis. And one of them would get well and thrive, and one wouldn't. I never could quite figure that out until I began to discover that one of those people had a sense of meaning in their life, and one didn't. I was making rounds with the family medicine residents one day, and we went in a room of a patient who had severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And she was sitting up, and when the attending physician or the family medicine resident asked how they were doing, she was so sort of breath, couldn't answer the question. The attending physician asked the resident what the latest x-ray looked like and what the latest oxygen saturation looked like. And finally, they asked her, have you used your inhaler? And all we could hear was, it's not helping. I was trying to teach the residents how to do a spiritual assessment on a patient. And at that point in these encounters, the attending physician would say, John, what's your take on this? And I walked over and sat down on her bed and put my hand on her back. I asked her a question: how do you deal with this spiritually? Of course, most folks think the minute you say spiritual, you're asking a religious question. And that's okay. And she said, Doctor, I'm a Christian. I read my Bible every day. I don't go to church anymore. And I said, I know a lot of people who are Christian because they don't go to church. Doubt. And I asked her a couple more questions. And then I saw on that little Mayo stand, that bedside thing, you know, that they put your meal on when you're in the hospital, there was a picture of some kids. And I said, are those your grandkids? And she said, that's what keeps me alive. my grandkids. And that was the extent of the conversation. And I stood up off the bed and took my hand from her back, and she was breathing as calmly as any one of you all are right now. And so the doubt that I had about why some patients would get well and some wouldn't began to find some answers for itself. There was a spiritual thing going on, a sense of meaning in life. Matthew Fox's program was one where my interest was in spiritual development and how that happened. Fortunately, Matthew Fox was a big believer in what the mystics like Meister Eckhart, Hildegard of Bingen, Teresa of Avila, and John of the Cross, and those folks had done in their work about spirituality. And he didn't leave out some modern day mystics like Thomas Merton and others. But what's another one of my doubts? When did another doubt appear for me? Some of you might remember that 9/11, the things that were the turmoil that we felt in this country. In an attempt to address, I apologize for this, I don't know how to fix that. In an attempt to address that turmoil, President Bush scheduled a service in the National Cathedral. I don't remember the theologian that he had in there with him, but I do remember at the beginning of that service, there was a procession with the American flag and the Christian flag going down the aisle and being placed in the chancel area. The doubt that I had then was, are we attempting to put the Christian flag beside the American flag to justify what we were fixing to do next? Now, I'm not saying what we did right or wrong. You can make that decision for yourself. But that was a time in my life that I remember having doubt about what the church was all about. I have, for those of you who don't know, Patsy leads a committee that schedules lessons for the upper room class that meets here in this room on Sunday morning. And I have, when they're scheduled, when they're getting ready to have one of those meetings, I get the question, John, what do you want to teach and when do you want to teach it? There's a lesson that I want to teach about how the religious community is going to respond to what the James Webb Telescope discovers. And the James Webb Telescope is confirming for us that the entire cosmos has been evolving for close to 14 billion years. And there's nothing that has been discovered to suggest that it's not going to continue to evolve. Now, religion as we know it in the Christian tradition is nowhere near 14 billion years old. It sort of showed up as a speck on that time scale. What is the role of Christians in response to something that's been happening for 14 billion years and is going to continue to happen to 14 billion years? Some of you might hear about those lessons or that lesson and decide to come hear more about what John has to say about that. That'd be fine. I'm concerned that we've got two choices. One is that we can interfere with that process, which I believe was put in place on the first morning of the first day, 14 billion years ago, by the Creator that we worship when we worship today. And so interfering with that process causes me some heartburn. I'm pretty convinced that the primary role of every part of the universe, including roses and humans, is to facilitate that process that the Creator put in place 14 billion years ago. So those are some of my concerns, some of my doubts. I'm going to tell you some things in just a minute that have happened within the last 10 days or 2 weeks that just jump off the page at me and cause me to doubt. Before I do, having fessed up to some of what my doubts are, I'm going to ask you that question one more time. Any of you all ever been faced with doubt that arose out of your faith community? Any of you want to say anything about that?
So many through the years, so many. The very first one that I can remember, I was 12, had been through confirmation classes at the Methodist Church in Charlotte that our family belonged to. Sitting there on Saturday afternoon in a little circle with the minister, preparing us for the next morning when we were to be confirmed into the church. Giving the message that you were to sign on, this is my adult thinking, sign on the dotted line that if you are to believe that Jesus is your Lord and Savior, and if you don't believe that, you are going to go to hell. And I'm sitting there thinking, all these weeks, you've been telling us God is love. The whole world was not born into a Christian family in America the way I was. So it didn't make one whit of sense to me that you could say God is love, and that if you don't believe in the Lord Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you're going to go to hell. So I raised my hand at 12 and said, that makes no sense to me. And I've been asking that question for years. At 81, I know the answer now.
Joan, you've got the book.
I've got the book, I highlighted it, read it, dog-eared
And
it.
how many of the stories in that book that Brian McLaren tells sound exactly like what Joan just said, over and over and over again? So when I was teaching over at Wofford, I asked the students, how many of y'all keep up with current events or get some of the current news? And I thought none of them would raise their hand. Every one of them raised their hand in that class. And I started asking, where do you get your news? And surprisingly, I got answers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Where do I get my news? I read the New York Times. I read the Washington Post. I read the Wall Street Journal. And I watch the Braves on television. August the 23rd, Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times. Nicholas is an occasional opinion columnist, is writing about America losing religious faith. And he says this, to be clear, the United States remains an unusually pious nation by the standards of the rich world. The Pew survey reports that 63% of the American adults identify as Christians, but that 63% is down from 78% just 15 years ago. And in that same period, the percentage of adults who say they have no religion has risen from 16% to 29%. Both of those are going in the wrong direction for those of us who are here tonight. He says if that trend continues, by the mid-2030s, fewer than half the Americans will identify as Christian. So it's obvious to me that I'm not the only one having doubt, or Joan and I are not the only ones having doubt. He goes on to say, Jerry Falwell dismissed AIDS as God's lethal judgment on promiscuity. He conveyed a sanctimoniousness that in the 1980s and 90s allowed much of the religious right to turn a cold shoulder to the suffering of people with the HIV virus. Jesse Helms, the leader of the religious right in the Senate, even suggested in 1995 that funds for fighting AIDS should be reduced because gay men contract the virus through deliberate, disgusting, revolting conduct. Then Christoph, indignation gets the best of him, and he says, in retrospect, the most immoral conduct in America in the late 20th century was not taking place in gay bathhouses, but in conservative churches where blowhards preached homophobia and embraced bigots like Helms and Falwell. Then in 2001, Falwell and Pat Robinson suggested that the September 11th terror attack was God's punishment for the behavior of feminists, gay people, and secularists. Christoph says his view is that God should have sued them for defamation. So, Falwell and Helms, Robinson are all gone now, but their legacy remains. September the 5th, 2023. An article, it's not pro-life to oppose a program that has saved 25 million lives. Some of you might remember that an opinion writer with the Washington Post by the name of Michael Gerson was in the cabinet of the George W. Bush presidency. And he helped President Bush to initiate a program called PEPFAR, and that stands President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. And that plan began to distribute antiretroviral drugs worldwide. 25 million lives has been saved by that program. Hundreds and hundreds of women who were pregnant at the time that drug was made available to them delivered live babies that tested negative for the HIV virus. An incredibly successful program. The authorization for that program runs out in a month from today. Republicans in Congress so far have refused to agree to reauthorizing that program with the accusation that the money is being spent on abortions. And they've never spent a penny on abortions. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robinson's legacy is alive today, and it causes me to have doubts about this thing we call the Christian church. What about science and religion? All of you know that the Methodist Church is in a bit of turmoil right now. It's the same turmoil that the Episcopalians have been through and the Presbyterians have been through. And, you know, some people benchmark off of other events. The Methodists weren't able to benchmark off what the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians did. We've got to have our own paint for this, and that's getting ready to happen. An article appeared in the Journal of Religion and Health this year, in April of this year. The title of the article is Science, Scripture, and Sexuality, the U.S. United Methodist Church at a Crossroads. And what the authors did in this is to survey the literature about the Methodist Church and this debate that's been going on for the last 30 or 40 years in our church about the language and the discipline, and have surveyed the literature, most of it now less than a decade, about what's being learned around the biology of a person's sexuality. And it's rather amazing. The conclusion that they draw is that the louder voices in the church today are more convinced that any morality that needs to be followed is only dependent on Scripture and not on reason or experience. Translate the word reason into science. And the science is now showing us that there are genetic and biological indicators for what a person's sexuality is going to be, regardless of the sex assigned to them in the delivery room. But the church has not been willing to buy into that. And when I say the church, I don't mean this church, I mean the church. I'm convinced that every revelation of truth, whether a 3-year-old down in our preschool discovers that truth, or whether somebody in the cancer lab over at the hospital discovers that truth, or whether the operator of the James Webb Space Telescope discovers that truth, I am convinced that every truth that I'm able to grasp and understand is not just a revelation about the subject being studied, it's a revelation about God. But Joan wasn't told that when she was a 12-year-old. A lot of people are not being told that today. A lot of people are being told that if you think evolution's happening, you're not going to make it to the big house. If you think LGBTQ people are not sinners, not going to make it to the big house.
Is there a big house?
If you think they are sinners, you're not going to make it to the bigger.
Might not be a big.
They may not be.
Maybe right here.
Now, confession, okay? My background, science. I come from a very patriarchal, left brain, numbers oriented, scientific family. My dad was a chemist who ran a family textile chemical business. I went to Georgia Tech to undergraduate school, then I went to medical school, and then I was practicing medicine. And until I got interested in spirituality and healing, my family background, my education background, and my vocational background was all left brain science. So you could argue, well, no wonder John's standing up there saying that the church needs to embrace science and not just the Scripture for its moral compass. Nonetheless, we're asked to believe things that post-enlightenment, post-scientific revolution people struggled to believe. And when I was teaching over at Wofford, I had a chance to interact with students who are now several generations, maybe 30 generations past the scientific revolution. And they're not going to buy some of the stories that we keep telling in churches. That doesn't mean the stories that they do buy are wrong or bad. It might just mean that we need a different language, a different set of words. August 21st, in the Washington Post, a guy named Perry Bacon wrote an opinion piece. I left the church and now I long for a church for the nuns. Everybody know what the nuns are. You know, words come along and they wind up. I wonder if woke has gotten into the dictionary. Perry Bacon grew up in a religious home, but he began to have experiences of being asked to believe things that he just couldn't believe, and being asked to behave in ways now so that some reward was out there. And he wound up basically leaving the church. And in this article, he's talking about what a lonesome situation that is. The one thing that he most misses about church is community. The thing he misses second most is music. He didn't mention preaching. I can't tell you how many articles have appeared in the news since Bacon wrote this just a couple of weeks back, and the response has not just been in the Washington Post, it's been in the New York Times, it's been in the Wall Street Journal. And the response is over and over and over again been sympathy for Bacon, and sympathy being expressed by people who are experiencing a loss of community and the lonesomeness that goes with that. There's a really interesting book by Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General of the United States now, on loneliness. He describes that as perhaps the most serious illness that we have in this country today is loneliness. And the church of the nuns that Bacon would like to see come back again, or to appear, at least would be a church that fosters a community. But you know, with all those people leaving, and by the mid-2030s, fewer than half the people will acknowledge that they're Christian. How can you not doubt that the church has an issue, that the church has a problem? And if you doubt, what is the journey forward? That'll take up the next 4 sessions that Paige and Arthur and Cam and Joan will lead. August the 30th, Pope Francis was quoted as having expressed in unusually sharp terms his dismay at a very strong, organized, reactionary attitude opposing him within the U.S. Roman Catholic Church. And what Pope Francis was lamenting was the backwardness, quote, backwardness of some American conservatives who he said insist on a narrow, outdated, unchanging vision. They refuse, he said, to accept the full breadth of the church's mission. What is that full breadth of the church's mission, according to Pope Francis? Our defense of the innocent unborn needs to be clear, firm, and passionate. Equally sacred as the Catholic Church's defense of abortion. Equally sacred, however, are the lives of the poor, those already born, the destitute, and the abandoned. How can you oppose that? But the American Catholic priests and bishops are opposing that. And when you hear about that opposition, How can you not have doubt? I mentioned Richard Rohr a while ago, who's the founder of the Center for Action and Contemplation. I get Richard Rohr's daily meditation every day. Today's the 6th. 3 days ago, Rohr talked about an alternative orthodoxy. And he's talking about Francis of Assisi, who's the founder of the Franciscan order that Rohr belongs to, and also one of the leading early opponents of the doctrine of the Trinity. He starts by saying Francis and Clare was another of the mystics in Francis's generation who did a lot with St. Francis of Assisi. Rohr says for Francis and Clare, Jesus became someone to actually follow and imitate. Francis's starting place is human suffering instead of human sinfulness, and God's identification with that suffering in Jesus. Francis's Christ was cosmic while also deeply personal. His creation, his cathedral was creation itself, and he preferred the bottom of society to the top. He invariably emphasized inclusion of the seeming outsider over any club of insiders, and he was more of a mystic than a moralist. I could go on and on. All I did was read the news for the last 2 weeks, and all those examples jumped up. And I'm assuming that if I dared turn CNN or Fox or MSNBC or even the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, that instead of having 5 or 6 examples, I could come in here with a moving truck full of examples of reasons to doubt if you're a faithful, believing person today. I've had experiences over in that sanctuary right over there of reasons to doubt. I've confessed 2 or 3 things here. Here's another one. Okay. If you come over there on a Sunday where the Apostles' Creed is being used in the service, you will not see me saying the Apostles' Creed. About 4 Sundays ago, a member of this church approached me out in the parking lot, and we made small talk for a minute. And then he said to me, "John, there's something you need to do." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You need to say the Apostles' Creed." I said, "Don't hold your breath." I said, I cannot do that. And he said, "Well, I do. It works for me." And I said, "I respect that. And I will defend anybody who tries to tell you you can't use the Apostles' Creed. It means something for you. It doesn't mean anything for me." And you know what his answer was to me? "I respect your position, boss." Many of you take the Herald, Spartanburg paper.
That's good.
You probably read what I'm fixing to share with you as I get ready to wrap this up. This past Sunday, 2 weeks after publicly coming out as gay, former Bob Jones University student Andrew Pledger heard a knock on his door. This was the final semester of his senior year. A university official stood outside and told the then 21-year-old to make his way to the official's office for a meeting. If you read the article, you already know what happened. If you didn't read the article, I bet you already know what happened. He was kicked out of school in the last semester of his senior year. Lance Weldy is a former Bob Jones University student who edited a collection of personal essays by LGBTQ alumni. Bob Jones, the title of that collection was Bob Jones University and Me, Queer Voices from the Most Christian University in the Country. That's the title of that essay that he wrote. That Christian university gives me reason to doubt. So I might be the only one that you would hear say some of the things I've said tonight. But I wonder if you don't think McLaren was hearing some of those things as he moved around the country. And as he did, McLaren is a deep, insightful thinker. He's written 15 books, and I guess Will Willimon has written more than that. But sometimes I wonder about people who are writing that prolifically, if their writing hadn't sort of gone to their head. But I've read most of McLaren's books, and I find that each one that he writes touches an issue that gives me some instruction or some understanding, or causes me to ask questions that result in growth. And as long as he does that, I'll keep reading McLaren. I'm looking forward already to his next book. And in this book, what you'll hear, if you're able to participate with us over the next 5 weeks, is how McLaren said people like John Simmons can continue in a path of faith and what the steps are along that path. And he names them, the first step being simplicity. And maybe that's where I am now. Maybe I've oversimplified this. Maybe it's something I'm missing, okay? Complexity, perplexity, and finally, harmony. And then on the last session, Andy Crossland's going to sort of wrap this up with some sort of summary. We've got about 10 minutes. If anybody's got a question or a comment you'd like to make. I know it's almost too hot in this room to think, isn't it? Those of you who've joined us tonight who are not usually here, we're delighted that you're here. We hope we've made you feel welcome enough that you would come back. And as I mentioned, we are really interested in our community as much as we are in our membership. Arthur, you got a comment or two?
Just one of the things that I like about McLaren's approach is he says doubt is always necessary to propel us on to greater growth. And a lot of us can look back over our lives and realize that, thank goodness we hit the brick wall a time or two and had to work through things, because hopefully you end up with something that's of a stronger faith is a possibility. And I think that's part of McLaren's approach, is that, these are steps that you go through, and if you know what they are, it kind of gives you hope that you can you can put some things back together. A book that I've been reading again is Finding God in the Waves by Science Mike McHarg, who was a Southern Baptist deacon who decided he'd read the Bible from cover to cover. And when he got to Revelation, he closed it and said, "That does it. I no longer believe." He had never read the Bible. He is now a United Methodist. He left his very cramped kind of tradition and came into United Methodism, where he was able to rewrite his whole story in a new setting that has given him cause for hope and faith. And I think we're going to be working on that some together during this time. It's doubt is your friend. I think it's one thing that John's been saying tonight. It can be your friend.
And as I mentioned, it's been a stimulus for growth for me. I've always been a pretty optimistic person. I think if I were willing to submit to psychoanalysis, somebody might say that I was someone who had a fair amount of resilience, because I've had some disappointments in life that I was able to bounce back for and be in a better place after the disappointment. I think that's the way you define resilience. And through all of that, I've been able to maintain my optimism. When I say my prayers, one of the things that I pray for is that my life will not end with me being a cynical person. I'm as optimistic about the church today as I have ever been. I think the potential for the church to be an effect, for the church to have agency, if you will, in a community has never been bigger than it is right now. One of the other experiences I've had with Wofford students is for them to tell me that we're probably not coming over there at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. That doesn't hold anything for us anymore. But if you got a project you want us to work on, call us and we'll be there. I think the generation behind me and 2 generations behind me can recreate or re-stimulate faith communities in a way that Jesus would be pretty proud of. Jesus didn't say, worship me. He said, follow me. See you all next week.